Last time we got about halfway through covering all the errors that Dubey made in his 200 proofs for a flat Earth. Today we're going to finish that up. Welcome back to the Nexus. I hope you have a drink and are comfortable because we have some craziness that will come up later that is unbelievable. But we have a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. The next section we have to talk about are the parts pertaining to weather and climate, starting with axial tilt. The Earth has an axial tilt of about 23.5 degrees, as measured from the plane of our orbit around the Sun. This varies slightly from between 22.1 to 24.5, but overall is pretty much negligible. This tilt means that the northern and southern hemispheres receive different amounts of direct sunlight depending on where we are in our orbit of the Sun. It is for this reason that while it is summer in the northern hemisphere, it is winter in the southern hemisphere and vice versa. No real mystery there. This also explains the midnight sun phenomena in the northern and southern hemispheres. Footage of both do exist, though due to the need to stay relatively close to the coast, Antarctic research stations do experience less of the phenomenon slightly due to being at higher latitudes than the actual South Pole, but the phenomenon is still obviously occurring even then. Now, you claimed that the Earth is colder at its closest point to the Sun and showed this with an illustration of an ellipse. You are way off on how much of an ellipse the Earth has around the Sun, though, and your illustration is misleading. See, in grade school, we are told that our orbit around the Sun is circular, and that is more or less accurate. In reality, we actually orbit in an ellipse, but it is a 3% ellipse. Do you know what a 3% ellipse looks like? It's one of these two images. Can you tell the difference? You likely can't at a glance, so our orbit is nowhere near as exaggerated as you made it out to be. I know a Google search will pull up a result of 0.016 orbital eccentricity, or 2% if you round it up, but taking both ends of the ellipse into account gives you a total of about 0.03 or 3% for the total ellipse. I did that so I can give you as much leeway as mathematically possible and realistically more than you deserve. For our purposes, a total of 3% ellipse will be close enough as an example, so no matter how you look at it, our orbit is damn near circular. Now, we do have a position at perihelion that is closer to the Sun than at aphelion, but there's not much difference in there. At perihelion, we are at about 91 million miles away from the Sun. At aphelion, we're at 94 million miles. Not a whole lot of change. I mean, we are talking about a 3% ellipse, which is damn near circular. Our orbit around the Sun with our constant rotation is also why clocks won't have to flip 12 hours at each solstice either. Remember, your fellow flat earthers measured a 15 degree per hour drift, meaning the Earth is rotating. And if they had left it on all day, they would have seen a lateral movement of about a degree a day roundabouts, meaning that we are moving laterally too. The combination of these factors is why clocks don't flip 12 hours like you say they would, and you are erroneously thinking that the Sun moves around the globe in a geocentric model, or that the Earth doesn't rotate, which we've already established is wrong. That shows you don't even know what model we are using, and mixing and matching out of ignorance or stupidity, likely both. Did you even do any proper research on any of this? Everything you've mentioned or will mention is easily explained with a simple Google search of sources that are actually reputable. At this point, with your constant referencing of data from the 1800s and your apparent fascination with sundials, I think you might be a man out of time. So whatever time warp brought you here, you need to get back to and stop spreading bad information. The difference between Arctic and Antarctic climate is easily explained by the fact that the Arctic region is mostly water, while the Antarctic is a fucking landmass that is more resistant to changes in temperature from the ocean currents, though the global warming we are causing is melting both regions at an alarming rate. In case you didn't know, areas that are damn near barren for the fact that they are either covered in permafrost or largely are very, very cold throughout the year don't have much in the way of wildlife. They don't have much in the way of plant life. And you see different biomes throughout the entire world. It doesn't match up with latitude. Death Valley in California is the hottest place on Earth. It's in the middle of the United States. You can hit virtually any kind of biome you want to in the United States, depending on where you go. You want to hit a rainforest? Fine. Go up to the northwestern regions of the United States. You want to get into a tropical area? Go down to Florida. You want to go to a desert? Death Valley's right there, along with a couple of other states that are virtually all deserts. There's no big mystery here. Next, we have astronomy to cover, and Dubey, yeah, you fucked up here considerably as well. To start with, you cited the Michelson-Morley Aether experiment as if that was supposed to show a flat Earth. It wasn't. The Aether experiment disproved the existence of a physical medium that light would use to propagate through the space between Earth and the Sun, like sound waves propagating through the atmosphere. That is all it was testing for, and the experiment showed that such a medium does not exist. You also cited a proposed experiment that was supposed to disprove parallax, I think. I'm not sure because you didn't say. So let's go over the motion of stars relative to Earth and talk about parallax too. The way you describe the motion of the globe has you under the impression that stars should be moving every which way from the perspective of a view on Earth. What you seem to fail to understand is that the Earth and our solar system are not the only things moving in the galaxy, let alone in the universe. Everything is moving at a constant rate. And the sheer distances that these bodies are away from us means that their movement relative to us doesn't change much. It is for this reason that our own 15 degree per hour rotation that is responsible for the appearance of stars rotating over us. The distances involved also mean that our orbit around the sun results in these bodies moving visually very little from our perspective. We are, after all, talking about measurements in light years. This is why constellations don't change much in position and have remained roughly the same since we first named them. That isn't to say they won't change, and in fact they are slightly shifting constantly. It's just that, again, the distances involved make any visual change difficult to detect. The globe also accounts for the inability to see certain constellations at certain latitudes because they are obstructed by the Earth itself as they fall below the horizon. I don't know where you got the idea that Polaris is visible at 20 degrees south latitude, because everything I found says that it falls to the horizon at the equator and becomes obstructed by the horizon any further south, but I think I may have an idea where this idea came from. Remember earlier when I mentioned Earth's axial tilt is about 23.5 degrees, and that Polaris, true north, and magnetic north don't marry up? Depending on where you are and the time of year, you might, with atmospheric refraction, be able to see Polaris from that far south. But again, it would require you to be at very specific locales at specific times of the year and would not be uniform across the entire 20 degrees south latitude. I also need to point out that not only does Earth have an axial tilt, but it has an axial precession, that is, the rotation of the axis itself. Much like a top, when it slows down, will no longer stand straight up and will begin to wobble. This precession is extremely slow, but detectable, taking approximately 26,000 years to complete one cycle. This is why Polaris isn't perpetually locked over the North Pole and will in fact not always be the North Pole star. In about 13,000 years, the pole star will be Vega until the precession returns to Polaris roughly another 13,000 years later. This, of course, brings us to an explanation of parallax, which is how we measure the distances to these stellar bodies. There are other methods we use for bodies that are further out than the parallax method can accurately measure, but that is a bit advanced for you, so we'll stick to the basics for this video. First, for context, you need a biology lesson. Humans and other predators have forward-facing eyes that are close together. This gives both eyes an overlapping view, allowing for 3D vision and, more importantly, depth perception. Parallax measurements use this same principle. If you want to know how far away a stellar body is, you set up a telescope to view it, and while accounting for your position on the planet and the time you make an angle measurement, roughly 6 months later you do the same thing again, with some simple geometry and trigonometry that you can then use the angles to determine how far away the body being observed is by calculating where those measured angles intersect. Depth perception on a stellar scale. There's obviously a margin of error in these calculations, but as our equipment gets more accurate, our measurements can be refined further. The next category we have to cover is straight up conspiracy theories, starting with the idea that no one is allowed to go to Antarctica because it is a no-fly zone and is constantly guarded, which is absolutely false. We already talked about why aircraft don't fly over Antarctica in the aviation section. You can take a trip to Antarctica, though, without any problem. It's expensive as hell, about 10 grand per person at the high end, and about half that if you want to sacrifice accommodation, space, and food quality, among other things. Since someone in the flat earth community was able to drop 20 grand on a ring laser gyro in an attempt to disprove the Earth's 15 degree per hour rotation, an experiment which subsequently failed and was admitted to on Beyond the Curve, a Netflix documentary about flat earthers, by the way, then you should collectively be able to fund a trip to Antarctica for a handful of your peers. Obviously, trekking across the continent isn't something that a normal tour will allow because it is completely barren and will require more than the clothes on your back to pull it off. But I'm sure if you go through the proper channels, you can put together an expedition that will take you across the continent. It won't be cheap, though, due to the obvious risks involved, but at the very least, you will be able to see that Antarctica is not under armed guard to prevent people from traveling to it, and it isn't a wall, as you can walk right across it. I don't know why, but the Freemasons or the Illuminati are always cited as being the source of, or the groups responsible for whatever cover-up is suspected. And in this case, it is supposedly the Freemasons as the source of the deception for whatever reason, which in this case seems to be for religiously motivated reasons, to make people lose faith in God so people can be indoctrinated to believe in the globe and convince people we are just an accident, and so we focus on materialism or whatever else. Dubey doesn't understand evolution either, and that particular video will come up another time. He also thinks the moon is a transparent body, which has never been visited. Go figure. Both of which are easily disproven. See, we left shit on the moon when we went there, and sufficiently powerful optics can be used to see the landing sites and the things we left there. We also left scientific equipment up there, including a couple of reflectors, which are used by observatories to reflect lasers fired from them back to the Earth, so that the recession of the moon can be measured. It's recessing at about a centimeter per year, by the way. The moon, due to its initial proximity to the Earth when it formed, the result of an impact with a body the size of Mars' moon Deimos, has it rotationally tidally locked, meaning that it completes one revolution each orbital period around the Earth. It appears to orbit us once per day due to the rotation of the Earth, when in reality it has an orbital period of 28 days, as evidenced by the different phases of the moon, which would be accelerated along with when tides happen if it orbited every day. There was a claim about other planets not being spheres either, despite being able to not only see the rotation of these bodies, but also based on the amount of light reflected from the surface of them, they are quite obviously three-dimensional spheres. As with the Freemasons apparently covering the shape of the Earth up, they've enlisted the help of NASA and other space agencies from around the world. He apparently doesn't realize that the US doesn't have the best relationship with some of the countries these other agencies fall under, and doesn't realize that maintaining silence on such a conspiracy that would be global and involve rival countries would be impossible. Someone would have come forward by now, if only to sow political unrest in other governments when the people discovered they had been lied to, seeing as that hasn't happened, and that we have in fact put several people into space, including the Apollo missions and missions to the ISS, not to mention communication, navigation, and military spy satellites that have been put in orbit. I'd say the Earth being a globe is pretty well indicated. Speaking of satellites, the reason they make composite images is because they are in low Earth orbit and consequently aren't high enough to obtain an individual photo of the Earth. As a result, composite images must be made where several images are taken in succession and stitched together. Speaking of photos, the reason the Apollo missions had to follow strict steps to take pictures of the Earth is because they were using actual film instead of digital methods we use today. And since they had limited exposures they could use, and the conditions were vastly different from what they would be on the surface, they had to expose it sufficiently to take a picture, but not overexpose the film, which would have overwhelmed it. During development, the time sections would have been exposed to development chemicals would have been tweaked, which is why some sections of the original photos are surrounded by what looks like a box. That section's exposure to the chemical agents had to be changed by covering it with tape so it would not be overexposed to said chemicals, rendering the negative useless. There is no evidence that footage from the ISS is obtained with wire suspension and green screen. That is just your incredulity with a bit of paranoia mixed in, especially since you can see the ISS with a telescope, and it obviously isn't a hologram, a drone, or a fucking shooting star, since you can watch live feed from the ISS to know where and when to look to see it based on that Water is actually used in spacesuits as a coolant because of ease of use and because it isn't moving much heat like the radiator fluid in your car does. It can do this because of the insulation the suit has, which shields the astronauts from that heat we were talking about earlier. Engineers are well aware of how to thermoregulate things in space, and you obviously don't know anything about it, as we covered last time. The last and most insane thing I think I saw in your video concerns sun and moonlight having different effects, and to make sure I don't appear to misrepresent you here, here's that very section from your own mouth.
The sun's light is golden, warm, drying, preservative, and antiseptic, while the moon's light is silver, cool, damp, putrefying, and septic. The sun's rays decrease the combustion of a bonfire, while the moon's rays increase combustion.
This is only a small bit of that whole section, and it gets even more insane. First of all, sun and moonlight aren't preservative and putrefying, respectively. This is another one of those outdated and stupid ideas from circa 1800 and prior. Seriously, Dubey, update your information and either go back to the 1800s where you belong or figure out what we've learned since then. The light from the sun does not decrease the combustion of a bonfire any more than the light of the moon increases it. In the bright light of the sun, you can't see some of those higher flames because they are outshone by the sunlight, while without that, in night conditions, you can see them. There's literally no difference, and you could see that with thermal imaging.
Plant and animal substances exposed to sunlight quickly dry, shrink, coagulate, and lose the tendency to decompose and putrefy. Grapes and other fruits become solid, partially candied and preserved, like raisins, dates, and prunes. Animal flesh coagulates, loses its volatile gaseous constituents, becomes firm, dry, and slow to decay. When exposed to moonlight, however, plant and animal substances tend to show symptoms of putrefaction and decay. This proves that sun and moonlight are different, unique, and opposites, as they are in the geocentric flat model.
You see what I had to subject myself to for this? No, Dubey, that isn't how any of this works. The reason sunlight does what you say is because of the heat energy produced and subsequently transferred to the Earth. This isn't a quick process either and takes several days, which means your idiocy about the moonlight causing putrefaction is wrong too. How do you function here in modern times? At this point, I'm not sure how you don't view a light bulb as the work of Satan.
In direct sunlight, a thermometer will read higher than another thermometer placed in the shade. But in full direct moonlight, a thermometer will read lower than another placed in the shade. If the sun's light is collected in a large lens and thrown to a focus point, it can create significant heat, while the moon's light collected similarly creates no heat. In the Lancet Medical Journal from March 14, 1856, particulars are given of several experiments which prove the moon's rays, when concentrated, can actually reduce the temperature upon a thermometer more than 8 degrees. So sunlight and moonlight clearly have altogether different properties.
This experiment has a couple of issues that he obviously didn't account for. First off, even the slightest breeze will cause convection, cooling the liquid in question. The setup we see here shields one container from said breeze while the other is out in the open. We also don't see him properly account for the heat energy being radiated from the Earth that it absorbed during the day. Secondly, when the thermometer is removed from the liquid in the open, we don't see it and see if it's dried off or not, which again, due to convection, will cause cooler readings. That's why we have things like wind chill and heat index. On the whole, this is a horribly constructed experiment that, if done properly, would yield different results. Moonlight is a reflection of the sun, and as we have already established, it is not a perfect reflector. There simply isn't enough radiation, including thermal radiation, reflected to make any substantial difference in temperature. It's like trying to start a fire with a lens on a cloudy and overcast day. It likely isn't going to happen. I also don't care what a medical journal from 1856 says. They were using flawed methodology and what I can only call archaic instrumentation compared to what we have now. Cite something from this century, Dubey, or go the fuck home to your own time. That's the end of that, so now we can move on to the final section. There are a few things that didn't fit cleanly into any of the previous categories, so this last section is a final compilation of miscellaneous points. We will start with why what seems intuitive isn't necessarily right and often isn't, how we know that, and what we do to prevent such errors. The answer to all of this is, of course, the scientific method, which operates on methodological naturalism, that natural things cause the natural phenomena we observe. The process is set up to virtually eliminate bias in such a way that the process in its entirety can be objectively verified in peer review, which eliminates confirmation bias, the one type of bias that the scientific method has trouble eliminating. Experiments like the one done with the ring laser gyro are objective verifications of what we already know, and more sensitive and accurate equipment will lead to more accurate measurements, allowing us to refine our findings as new data comes in. The problem is that flat earthers generally won't concede error due to some emotional attachment. Let's face it, admitting you're wrong is difficult, especially if you hold a belief that the majority of people and scientists reject, like the flat earth. Holding to such embarrassingly wrong positions is the only way to keep associations with friends and associates in the group, and is more important than correcting errors and admitting mistakes. Doing so may initially hurt your standing, and you may lose most of your social group, but you will gain new friends and associates while also perhaps helping those you once agreed with see the errors as well. It's like coming out as an atheist. Sure, you'll lose associates and it will put a strain on other relationships, but the payoff is that you won't be wrong anymore about religion, and you will be better able and more willing to correct your errors. I've done it before, and may well do it again in the future. Ignorance may be bliss, but knowledge is power. The more you know that is accurate and has practical application, the less you have to carry, both literally and metaphorically. While we are on the subject, we need to clarify some scientific terminology you seem to be confused on, Dubey. Starting with a hypothesis, which is a proposed explanation for an observed phenomenon. It has to fulfill a couple of criteria to be valid, though. First, it needs to be possible, meaning that it has to have some precedent or parallel phenomena indicating it is a possibility. After that, it needs to be probable, as in having a greater than 50% chance to be correct, preferably. Next, it has to be testable in experimentation, and finally, it has to be falsifiable, as in it has to have a failure point, a criteria that shows the experiment is a failure. If at least some of these criteria cannot be met, then you have nothing worth considering. Next is a scientific law. A scientific law is a mathematical formula or statement that always holds true under a given set of circumstances, like Ohm's law or the law of monophyly for biology. Finally, we have the definition of theory. In the colloquial, everyday sense, a theory is a blind guess, but it has a couple of other meanings. That of a mathematical theory and a scientific theory, the latter of which will be what we focus on. A scientific theory is a scientific explanation for some aspect of nature having both explanative and predictive power. Theory is the highest confidence science has in a given hypothesis, and in order to graduate to that level, a hypothesis has to be proven in the legal sense by having an overwhelming preponderance of evidence supporting it and withstanding constant scrutiny and peer review indefinitely. Theories are higher than laws, and theories encompass all the data, associated laws, and other hypotheses that are part of it. There is a rule that theories can never be proved, only that they can be disproved or have all data consistent with them. This allows new data to be incorporated and for the theory to change if necessary, like when Einstein's theory of relativity replaced Newton's theory of gravity because it could account for what Newtonian gravity could not, specifically the movement of Mercury, which could not be accurately predicted under his model, but relativity could properly predict. Newtonian physics still work here on Earth, so it is still used. Becoming a theory today is a stricter process, which is why no scientific theory has been disproved and completely discarded and replaced in more than a century. We spoke earlier about inertia and why the atmosphere moves with the planet because of that, and along with that is the explanation of why pendulums that demonstrate the rotation of Earth are not self-starting. They are moving with the planet and won't spontaneously start swinging any more than you will suddenly start moving at Mach 1 out of nowhere. We are in motion with the planet and will continue to move in that manner unless acted on by an outside force. This is basic physics, Dubey. We also need to discuss why the second law of thermodynamics isn't an issue as it pertains to the atmosphere. The atmosphere does not produce much drag on the planet. In fact, it is negligible to the point of virtually not being a thing. The moon has greater influence on the speed of our rotation than the atmosphere does and will continue to do so until it recedes far enough away to leave orbit. You also take the description of the Earth being pear-shaped far too literally. The southern hemisphere being a continent, however, means that its tectonic plate resists the deformation, and as a result makes the southern pole wider than the northern pole area. This is detectable, but again, relatively minuscule amount that you are taking far too literally. We know the composition of the inner layers of the Earth through seismic detection, and is yet another indication of the shape of the Earth. When an earthquake happens, shock waves are propagated from the epicenter. A sufficiently powerful earthquake can be detected on the other side of the planet by sensitive enough equipment and using the known diameter of the planet, plus the time it took for those shock waves to reach the detecting station and the strength of those shock waves when they got there. By factoring all of that, we can accurately figure out what composes the core in particular, as well as its composition. If the Earth were a flat disk, this would not be possible. As for the size difference of the Sun and Moon, this is one of those things that parallax can show us, with the Sun in particular, and a similar method can be used to find the size and mass of the Moon. Lens distortion has a few causes and explanations depending on what you are referring to. Atmospheric distortion is obviously caused by the atmosphere and the light being distorted as it makes its way through the atmosphere. It's correctable, but I don't know if you're ready for that explanation since you don't understand simple stuff. You brought up GPS and satellite phone networks in reference to reception issues. Constellations of GPS communication satellites are set up in such a way that they cover the maximum amount of area at any given period of time. GPS itself is divided into 3 distinct parts. Ground stations, 5 of which are positioned all over the globe, with the master control station being in the United States. Those control stations issue orbital adjustment commands and time corrections due to the slight time dilation due to the velocity they're moving at. These time corrections are really milliseconds per week, but they stack pretty quickly, so they need to be regularly corrected for. Otherwise, GPS won't work properly. Yet another thing you can thank relativity for. Anyway, these corrections are transmitted to the constellation of 32 satellites, if memory serves, all at different locations over the Earth, arranged in such a way that any one location will have access to at least 3 of those sats. They aren't all active, as only about 26 are used at any given time. The others are backups. The final part of GPS is the user. The receiving device picks up the signals the satellites are constantly sending out about their position over the planet. One sat gives you GPS time, the most accurate time reference you can get on the planet. 2 sats don't give you much else except for another reference point, and give you a pretty general location with a pretty wide margin of error, with about 200 plus meters or so of error, if I'm remembering right. To get your location in latitude and longitude nailed down, you need to have 3 sats. And for your altitude, you need 4, which will further narrow down your lat and long to about 5 meters, which is about 30 feet or so. Pretty accurate overall. GPS systems will at minimum search for and track 3 sats, but at least 4 are tracked if possible. This is, of course, depending on the topography of a given area. Being in a deep valley will block the signal of potential sats, and being in a city with high-rise buildings all around you will result in a similar effect, along with signal echoes in both situations, which will confuse the system until cleaner signals are received. ComSats work and are organized in a similar fashion, though in a reduced number. Your satellite TV is provided by these satellites, which are mainly collected at points north and south of the equator, just north and south of the equator. Satellite dishes in the northern hemisphere point south for this reason, and dishes in the southern hemisphere point north in order to pick up the signals. These systems are both dependent on topography of a region, yet again. This explains why reception is sometimes difficult in certain areas, especially in Arctic and Antarctic regions, which have really limited coverage from all of these satellites, since the agencies responsible for them have set them up in order to reach the maximum amount of area, which is concentrated in areas other than the poles. With that, we have finally made it to the last point I need to cover in this video. The claim that the Bible says the earth is flat, therefore the earth is flat. Dubey, a 2,000 plus year old compilation of fables is not a reliable source of scientific information. No testable claim within it is correct, and the description of the earth in relation to the rest of the solar system, let alone the rest of the cosmos, is dead wrong. I don't give a damn what our ignorant ancestors and their God thought about the world, because they were demonstratively wrong. We have science to thank for that, despite the attempt of religion to stifle and retard discoveries counter to the doctrine in the Bible. We've established that the flat earth model, if you can call it that, because no one model accounts for or explains anything or everything, is a failure, and that every phenomena you brought up can be accounted for and explained on a globe without any problem. One globe model. One. I had to be extremely brief on many of the points. But if you have an issue with anything I said here, then by all means tell me how and why I am wrong, and and give me the evidence to prove it. Be ready, though, because if you do try to do that, I'll be here to rip apart whatever you say with factually accurate information from this century. So either go home to the 1800s or stop lying to people. Your choice, Dubey.